a warm salt. Heavy wind moves through the thin palms lining the quiet Florida street, brushing against a pale blue house that has not felt a human heartbeat in decades. The paint is blistered from the sun, the porch boards bend with memory, and the windows hold their reflections like they're afraid of letting go. Rachel stands at the walkway with a key in her hand, feeling time around her stretch. Mark unlocks the door, and the house exhales. Inside, the air's older than dust. It smells faintly of citrus and mildew, like someone once tried to make the place sweet before giving up. Their footsteps echo through still rooms filled with a silent expectancy. The house is neither frightening nor welcoming. It simply waits, as though it has been patient for far too long. They arrived only because of a letter, one that came without ceremony, informing Mark that his great-uncle's property was legally his. No one had spoken about this uncle in years, and even Mark's father never offered more than a shrug when asked about him. A distant relative, a quiet man, nothing more. So they drove hours south, imagining palm trees, oceanfront breezes, maybe a vacation home they could fix up and resell. But the moment they crossed the threshold, that idea felt naive. Houses with stories rarely let themselves be exchanged like furniture. Rachel wanders first. She has always been drawn to traces of other people's lives. Family photos that never got taken down, a handwritten address book on a kitchen counter, a cabinet filled with mismatched plates. These things tell her who lived here long before she knew the house existed. The living room wallpaper is the color of faded lemons, curling up at the edges like it is trying to peel away from memory. The furniture is covered in sheets, as though the house has been trying to protect what little it has left. She touches a dusty lampshade. Mark watches her from the hallway. He does not share her curiosity. He feels unsettled in an indescribable way, as if someone might still be inside. The house was locked when they arrived, but that does not comfort him. Some places feel lived in long after their people vanish. They open windows. Fresh air spills through the rooms, stirring curtains stiff with time. The dust dances upward, swirling like ash rising from something long burned out. The echo of their voices feels too loud, breaking the long-held hush. Rachel whispers that the house is beautiful. Mark replies without conviction. The kitchen is small and simple. Square tiles beneath their feet hold faint stains, coffee, maybe wine, perhaps something else. A calendar on the wall still hangs open to 1973, July, the hurricane season. No one bothered to flip the page. Neighbors begin to arrive as the couple unloads their car. They do not cross the property line. They linger near their yards, as if observing a ritual from a safe distance. An older woman offers a polite wave, her eyes pinned to the house instead of them. Another man stands in his driveway, pretending to tinker with his car while watching. They greet the couple, but their voices hold something practiced, something careful. They ask how long they plan to stay. When Rachel mentions inheriting the place from Mark's great-uncle, the neighbors nod too quickly, like that explains everything, though no explanation has truly been given. One neighbor, a man in his 60s with skin browned by decades of sun, crosses the uneven lawn and introduces himself. He speaks softly, tells him that the great-uncle kept to himself. Quiet man, odd but harmless. He doesn't linger long, and when he leaves, Rachel notices the way his eyes scan the house one last time before he turns away. Not curious, wary, as if he expects something to move in the windows. Evening falls slowly. The Florida sky softens into a watercolor wash of orange and purple. From the porch, they hear insects stir and the distant rust of ocean waves. The couple tries to enjoy the novelty of their inheritance, sipping cold drinks on weathered rocking chairs, imagining summer nights spent here. But every now and then, Rachel feels the back of her neck prickle, not from fear, but from the sensation of being watched. Not by a person, more like by time itself. Later, they explore more deliberately. In a hallway lined with old picture frames, Rachel stops. One photograph shows a young man, Mark's uncle, standing on the porch they just sat on. His expression is uncertain, like he was surprised the picture was being taken. His hands are smeared with paint. The background behind him is blurred, but Rachel thinks she sees movement in the window upstairs, as though someone else was in the house when the photo was taken. Mark pulls out faded mail from a small desk. Letters addressed to his great-uncle, postmarked decades ago. At the bottom of the pile is a small envelope sealed, never opened. It is addressed simply to the man in the blue house. The handwriting is uneven, like it was written by a child trying her best. He places it aside, uncertain whether to open it. They find no bedrooms on the first floor. The stairs creak loudly as they climb. A thin layer of dust softens each step. No one has walked here in many years. The hallway above is darker, quieter. The rooms feel untouched, frozen. One bedroom holds a simple iron bed, the mattress still made with crisp hospital corners. Another room has easels, brushes hardened into stone, canvases leaned against walls. Some canvases are blank. Others hold half-finished shapes. Strokes pause mid-thought. One canvas is turned toward the wall. Rachel moves to inspect it, but Mark stops her. "Not tonight," he says. They have seen enough for their first day. Before bed, Rachel steps out onto the upstairs landing. She feels a cool draft against her cheek and looks down the hallway. The attic hatch hangs slightly ajar, though neither of them remembers touching it. She calls to Mark, but when she looks again, the hatch appears closed. Maybe she imagined it. Maybe the house shifts with the night air. She tells herself this as she returns to their bedroom. Sleep comes fitfully. The house settles, sighs, cracks in places where it remembers moisture. Outside, cicadas sing, then fall silent as though listening. The couple sleeps lightly, but something above them does not. Something in the attic moves with the slow patience of memory, waiting for morning, waiting for them to return. And beneath the weight of silence, an old story stretches awake. A thin, persistent draft presses against a narrow pull chain that hangs from the attic door, making it sway gently, as if someone above were breathing. Rachel notices it first the next morning. The house is brighter, but the upstairs hallway is still dim, holding shadows that seem reluctant to leave. The draft shouldn't exist. No windows are open. The air is still elsewhere, but from that single door suspended above them, the cold continues to spill. Mark suggests they check the space before unpacking completely. He tries to sound casual, but his voice carries an undercurrent of tension. It isn't fear, just an unease he can't explain. The idea of the attic feels strangely heavy, like something meant to be ignored. He pulls the chain. The wooden door creaks open with the slow complaint of old hinges, and a ladder releases downward. A pulse of cold air flows over them, startlingly crisp, like air trapped for decades. Rachel shivers. She tries to laugh it off, but the sound feels out of place, too loud for the quiet upstairs. Mark climbs first, flashlight in hand, his movements cautious. The attic swallows sound. Each step on the ladder echoes, a hollow knock that travels upward into the dark. Rachel waits at the base, searching for any explanation for the cold. She calls up to ask what he sees. He doesn't answer at first. Dust blankets everything. When Rachel climbs up behind him, she feels as though she has ascended into a different time. The light from their flashlights dissolves only a small circle at a time, revealing stacks of small crates, trunks with brass corners, and used furniture covered in sheets that hang like half-forgotten ghosts. The air smells layered, paint, wood rot, the sweetness of mold, and something fainter beneath it all, almost like lavender long faded. At the far end, a stack of newspapers is piled nearly to the low slanted ceiling. The dates show the same range, early 1970s. Headlines about storms and community events and small accidents paint the picture of a simpler era. Some issues are water damage, warped around the edges, as though moisture once seeped in then disappeared. Along one wall sits a row of cardboard boxes marked only with years. 1969, 1970, 1971, and so on. Inside are envelopes bundled by twine. Some carry stamps. Others are simply folded sheets that appear never mailed. Their edges are brown by time, the ink fading like whispers half remembered. Rachel opens one box and finds small objects that belong to someone who lived a quiet, artistic life. Oil paint tubes, colors hardened, brushes worn, a ceramic mug holding pencils sharpened to nubs, a child's comb. Everything looks carefully placed, not abandoned. It feels curated, as though whoever left meant to return. At the center of the attic stands something large beneath an old canvas drape, a shape too tall and rectangular to be anything but a painting. The cloth covering it is heavy, stained, frayed at the edges. It hangs like a curtain meant to hide a secret no one should see unless invited. Rachel approaches slowly. As she lifts the cloth, dust cascades off, filling the air with glittering grains that catch the thin beam of the flashlight. The painting underneath emerges. A girl stares out. Her expression sits between curiosity and fear, lips slightly parted as though caught mid-breath. She looks 12 or 13, her brown hair falling just past her shoulders. But it is her eyes that hold them, one brown, one a startling pale blue. Her gaze seems to follow them across the attic. Behind her is the very house they stand in, painted in careful detail. The palm trees, the porch, even the peeling siding. But where the house's windows should be, the painter filled them with deep black, as if nothing inside were meant to be seen. The lack of light inside those windows makes the house appear hollow, like an organism with no heartbeat. The brushstrokes are uncomfortably vivid. The sky is streaked in unnatural shades, reds and grays swirling like an approaching storm. The girl's outline is surrounded by smudged shadows that look like hands reaching toward her, though never quite touching. Rachel feels an involuntary pang, an ache beneath her ribs. She can't explain why the painting feels alive. The girl does not look trapped. She looks watched, as though she sensed something approaching the moment the brush touched canvas. Mark tries to rationalize the unease. Old paintings can look unsettling after years in the dark, he says. But Rachel knows it isn't just the image. It's the emotion painted into it. Whoever made this was not trying to create beauty. They were trying to remember or warn. The canvas is thick, secure in its frame. The signature at the bottom right reads only initials, E.M. Mark's great uncle's name was Everett Monroe. They exchange a quiet glance. They search the space for other paintings. Some are rolled up, others lie stacked face to face. Each one they glance over seems unfinished, fragments of landscapes and blurred faces, but none hold the intensity of the first. Near the painting, a small stool and easel sit abandoned. Brushes lie scattered on the wooden boards. A palette dried into a hardened mosaic rests atop a crate. On the floor, a single paint rag still holds a faint smell of linseed oil. These things should smell stale. Instead, they carry the strange illusion of recent use, as though someone walked away mid-stroke decade ago and no time has passed since. Rachel traces a finger over the frame, feeling the grooves. Something about the girl feels familiar, not personally, but emotionally, like meeting a stranger whose sorrow she somehow recognizes. Her mismatched eyes remind Rachel of a child trying to tell the truth, but no one listened. Mark places the cloth back over the painting, though he must force himself to break eye contact with it first. The attic seems colder now. The space feels smaller, as though the painting has changed the air itself. They descend the ladder and close the attic door. Calm returns to the hallway, but neither of them speaks for a long time. They feel changed, like something in the house shifted when the canvas was uncovered. Downstairs, Rachel catches herself glancing upward, toward the ceiling. She imagines the painting still waiting behind its sheet, the girl's mismatched eyes staring toward the floorboards, listening for footsteps, sensing company after years alone. As evening comes again, the house seems to swallow light faster than it should. Shadows collect in corners, pressing quietly against the walls. The attic remains silent, but the memory of the girl lingers, her expression, the storm sky behind her, the darkness inside the painted house. A quiet message rests beneath every brushstroke, urging attention, asking not to be forgotten. And neither of them can shake the feeling that bringing the painting down into the living space will not simply reveal a mystery. It will awaken it. Dust still clings to their clothes the next morning, though they barely remember sleeping. Breakfast sits untouched on the kitchen counter. The house feels different now, less vacant, more aware. It no longer carries the stillness of an abandoned space. It listens. Every movement seems to stir an unseen memory. Mark returns to the attic, though reluctantly. Rachel follows. Sunlight struggles with a small round attic window, the beam slicing through dust like a blade. Together, they pull forward the trunk closest to where the painting stood. Its brass latch is stubborn, resisting until a sudden click releases it. Inside, they find letters. Dozens, maybe hundreds, bundled together with faded ribbons. Their paper yellowed but still intact. The envelopes are addressed to Ever Monroe, Mark's great-uncle, but they are not stamped. None seem to have been mailed. Each bears the same handwriting. Small, careful, almost delicate, as though the writer feared being misunderstood. The first letter opens with a greeting that reads like a whisper. Dear Mr. Everett, followed by a childlike excitement. The writer, a girl named Lila, describes her day, collecting seashells near the inlet, watching pelicans glide over the water, sharing lemonade with neighbors. Her voice seems bright, innocent. She mentions how much she likes visiting Everett's house because he listens, really listens, when she speaks. Rachel reads aloud. The script dances between joy and longing. Lila writes about how her parents are always busy, arguing, forgetting to ask about her day. But Everett notices everything. She says. He asks about her drawings, about school, about whether she's happy. She tells him she feels safe in his house, that it feels quieter than her own, like it understands her. As they read through more letters, a subtle shift emerges. The brightness dims. Lila begins describing sounds in the night. Soft footsteps outside her window, whispering voices coming to vents, the sound of something moving inside the walls. She writes how when she tells her parents, they insist she's imagining things. They tell her not to stay over at Everett's so often. He's too quiet, too odd, they say. But Lila insists he is kind. He paints while she reads, sometimes humming old songs she doesn't know. He never interrupts her thoughts, only nods when she shares her fears. Letter after letter paint a portrait of a girl who feels seen only in one place, the house that would one day swallow both her voice and Everett's. Some letters are short, only a few lines, as though written quickly to capture a sudden moment of fear. The whispers came again, she writes. They are louder now. I think they wanted to come closer. Another letter describes scratching beneath the floor at night. She wonders if it's raccoons, but the rhythm feels deliberate, too slow, too patient. Lila's handwriting becomes shaky. She writes that she no longer sleeps in her room. She curls up near her closet because the whispers are softer there. She asks Everett if she can stay with him more often. She says his house feels safe, until one night it doesn't. Another letter marks the turning point. The ink is smudged in places, the strokes frantic. Someone was outside my window, she writes. I saw their silhouette. They weren't tall. I thought it was a child, but then they moved wrong, like their limbs didn't bend right. She ends with a plea. Please let me come over tomorrow. I don't want to sleep here. A knot forms in Rachel's chest. Mark rests a hand on the trunk, silent, his face pale. The next bundle reveals her time at Everett's house. She describes helping him paint a rose bush, the coastline, portraits of neighbors. But one painting she refuses to describe in detail. She says it frightened her, not because of what she saw in it, but because she recognized something she couldn't name. You said you threw it away, she writes, but I still feel it somewhere. In later letters, she writes directly about the house. Not Everett's, but her own. It doesn't feel like mine anymore, she tells him. Sometimes I think the house is looking for me. She claims to hear her name call from vents, from beneath the floorboards, from behind closet doors. The whispers are not angry. They sound lonely. Her tone grows increasingly distressed. She writes about how shadows stretch too far across her bedroom floor, how the attic door creaks open even though no one pulls a chain, how something seems to be waiting for her at night, in the quiet hallway. It knows I come to your house, she warns Everett. It doesn't want me to leave. Rachel folds the letter slowly, feeling the sting behind her eyes. One letter stands out. The paper is torn at the edge, like it was ripped from a notebook. Lila writes that she saw someone, or something, standing at the end of the hall. It was small, childlike, but it made no sound. She could feel it watching her, even in the dark. She crawled into her closet, and didn't come out until morning light. Her parents insist she simply had a nightmare. Another letter arrives, dated only a week later. The tone is subdued. She thanks Everett for letting her stay overnight. She describes painting with him. She mentions how he placed a blanket over her while she napped, humming a tune she didn't know. She says the whispers didn't follow her there. A final cluster of letters is tied with string, more desperate than the rest. The first says, "Is found away in..." Lila describes hearing footsteps in her hallway that are not her parents. She writes that her mother told her to stop lying, that she's too old for imaginary fears. She ends a letter with a fragile statement. "I'm not safe here." The next letter reveals she hid in the crawl space under her house, certain something was in her room waiting. She heard it breathe. When she mustered the courage to look, nothing was there, but she knew it had been. Her final letter is short, the handwriting erratic. "Mr. Everett, I think it wants to take me. I keep hearing someone say my name, but it's not a voice I know. Last night, I saw the shadow again. It was smiling. I know you believe me. Please help me. Please don't let the house take me." There is no more. That last message leaves a silence that spreads across the attic like a cold fog. Mark and Rachel stare at the letters, their minds overwhelmed with questions that feel older than either of them. The room holds its breath. The presence of the painting downstairs, the one with the girl staring outward, suddenly feels heavier. These letters give her voice. They give shape to the sorrow painted into her mismatched eyes. Rachel wonders why the letters remained here. If they were never mailed, did Lila give them to Everett personally? Did he hide them, unable to face what they said? Mark sorts through the trunk again, more urgently now, as though expecting answers in its corners. He finds only small objects, a hair ribbon, seashells, a wooden puzzle with a missing piece, evidence of childhood preserved in a stranger's home. The final letter echoes in their minds. "Please don't let the house take me." Those words settle deep into their bones. As they descend the attic ladder once more, neither speaks. The letters feel heavier than paper. They feel like unfinished breaths, trapped between the girl's fearful hope and the silence that swallowed her. Downstairs, Rachel pauses in front of the painting. The girl's mismatched eyes seem more alive now, more knowing, as if she has been waiting all this time for someone to finally hear her. He took a road less traveled, slipping further into Quincy's wooded outskirts, where the homes thinned out and street lamps were scattered like tired sentinels. The fall breeze carried the scent of damp leaves and the faint sweetness of pine sap. His footsteps crunched softly on gravel, his breath visible in the cool night air. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, careful not to agitate the small weight inside. The camera felt heavier than it should have, as if it knew it was being dragged into a place where it didn't belong. Somewhere between the houses and the tree line, the world grew strangely quiet. Not the ordinary hush of a late hour, but an unnerving stillness, as though the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. He paused, listening. No cars, no dogs. Even the insects seemed to fall silent. It made him reconsider. No one had told him he needed to go this far, but the memory of that desperate voice still echoed in his mind. The girl pleading for help, the sharp static drowning her words. He promised himself he would at least see where the signal led. He took a step deeper into the woods. The darkness was thicker here, not absolute, but dense enough that the moonlight struggled to break through the branches overhead. The trees crowded close, their trunks sharp silhouettes against a faint glow. Each step felt louder than the one before, but he pressed on, tracking the faint blue ping on his phone. That was all he had to go by. No street names, no landmarks, just percentage bars and direction arrows. After several minutes, he noticed remnants of old structures, foundations swallowed by vines and half-rotted with jutting from the ground like bones. Quincy was full of abandoned places, homes left a time when mill workers moved away and never came back. People said the woods were haunted by memory more than anything else. As he surveyed the ruins, he felt the same sensation that had followed him since he left the house, like someone was pacing just a little behind him, keeping perfect step, yet remaining unseen. He tightened his grip on the camera and pressed forward. The deeper he went, the more foreign the woods began to feel. The remaining patches of moonlight dissolved into shadows that swayed with the breeze, bending the path into shapes that made him second-guess every direction. The phone's signal flickered, dipping from a steady pulse to a jittery, unstable glow. He lifted it higher, hoping for clarity, but instead it began to buzz softly, vibrating against his palm as if trying to warn him. The sound carried strangely through the trees, bouncing in a way that made him briefly imagine someone else holding a phone just like his, mirroring his movements. He caught his breath, convinced he heard twigs snapping somewhere off the path. He froze, waiting to hear footsteps, but the stillness returned as though the sound had never existed. The wind picked up, whispering through the branches overhead. He tried to convince himself that it was only the forest settling for the night, yet something about that explanation felt fragile, too convenient. Again, he remembered the voicemail, the panic in the girl's voice, the way she gasped as if running. What if she had come here too? What if she never left? He walked on, feeling the ground change beneath him. The soil became softer, sinking under each step. At first it felt like damp earth, but soon it gave like unsettled ground, as if hollow spaces lurked just beneath the surface. He slowed his pace, testing each step carefully. Large mounds rose around him, uneven, overgrown, indistinguishable in shape. He circled one of them, brushing leaves aside to reveal splintered boards. They resembled old storm shelters or storage spaces, collapsed long ago. He wondered if anyone still remembered they were here. Another faint sound cut through the silence, a clicking, rhythmic, and unnatural. It didn't belong to the forest. He turned slowly, raising the camera to his chest. The noise stopped the instant he moved, leaving behind a suffocating quiet. His heartbeat felt painfully loud. He tried to speak, to call out if anyone was there, but the words caught in his throat. He continued forward, convincing himself that fear was only temporary, but the feeling of unseen eyes lingered behind him like a shadow that refused to separate from his body. Somewhere near his feet, the ground shifted, releasing a muted creak beneath the foliage. He crouched, brushing aside layers of old pine needles. A rectangular outline emerged, wooden boards sealed tight, with a rust-coated latch. It resembled a cellar door, hidden deliberately. The air around it felt stale, touched with a scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. His pulse quickened as he pried gently along the edges, lifting the latch with the flat side of a broken stick. It clattered like metal teeth snapping open. He hesitated, swallowing dry fear before lifting the hatch. The hinges groaned, stretching as though waking from decades of sleep. A shallow staircase plunged downward into darkness. Cold air rushed up in a single exhale, brushing his skin, tingling like fingers. He switched on his phone light. The beam reached only halfway down before dissolving into black. Still, something inside compelled him, curiosity, yes, but also a sense of obligation, as if the painting itself had opened this door and now expected him to walk through. Each step creaked under his weight. The walls narrowed, closing in with a suffocating hush. At the bottom stood a small room, more like a storage pit than a basement. The walls were reinforced with aging wooden planks. Some had rotted through, allowing thin roots to snake inside. Dust floated in the air, swirling like forgotten breath. He spotted a table, small, crooked, half buried beneath a cloth stiff with age. On top lay a stack of photographs. He picked them up with trembling hands. They were black and white prints, curled at the edges. A family appeared in nearly all of them, a man and woman, standing stiffly in front of the same farmhouse he remembered from the painting. In some photos, a little girl stood by their side, bright-eyed, her smile hesitant but sincere. The girl resembled the one in the voicemail. His chest tightened. The photos grew darker as he flipped through them, shadows stretching across faces, smiles fading. In the later ones, the girl looked thinner, her expressions vacant, as if fear had begun hollowing her. Something about the father's eyes shifted too, once distant, now disturbingly alert. The last few pictures had been violently slashed across the lower half, leaving faces cut, removed, or erased by someone's furious hand. He felt a chill twist through him. A faint scraping echoed from deeper within the room, as though someone or something had shifted in the dark just beyond his light's reach. He turned sharply, pulse hammering, unsure whether he had just discovered the beginning of their tragedy or stepped into a final chapter of his own. Somewhere near his feet, the ground shifted, releasing a muted creak beneath the foliage. He crouched, brushing aside layers of old pine needles. A rectangular outline emerged, wooden boards sealed tight with a rust-coated latch. It resembled a cellar door, hidden deliberately. The air around it felt stale, touched with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. His pulse quickened as he pried gently along the edges, lifting the latch with the flat side of a broken stick. It clattered like metal teeth snapping open. He hesitated, swallowing dry fear before lifting the hatch. The hinges groaned, stretching as though waking from decades of sleep. A shallow staircase plunged downward into darkness. Cold air rushed up in a single exhale, brushing his skin, tingling like fingers. He switched on his phone light. The beam reached only halfway down before dissolving into black. Still, something inside compelled him. Curiosity, yes, but also a sense of obligation, as if the painting itself had opened his door and now expected him to walk through. Each step creaked under his weight. The walls narrowed, closing in with a suffocating hush. At the bottom stood a small room, more like a storage pit than a basement. The walls were reinforced with aging wooden planks. Some had rotted through, allowing thin roots to snake inside. Dust floated in the air, swirling like forgotten breath. He spotted a table, small, crooked, half buried beneath a cloth stiff with age. On top lay a stack of photographs. He picked them up with trembling hands. They were black and white prints, curled at the edges. A family appeared in nearly all of them. A man and woman, standing stiffly in front of the same farmhouse he remembered from the painting. In some photos, a little girl stood by their side, bright-eyed, her smile hesitant but sincere. The girl resembled the one in the voicemail. His chest tightened. The photos grew darker as he flipped through them, shadows stretching across faces, smiles fading. In the later ones, the girl looked thinner, her expressions vacant, as if fear had begun hollowing her. Something about the father's eyes shifted too, once distant, now disturbingly alert. The last few pictures had been violently slashed across the lower half, leaving faces cut, removed, or erased by someone's furious hand. He felt a chill twist through him. A faint scraping echoed from deeper within the room, as though someone or something had shifted in the dark just beyond his light's reach. He turned sharply, pulse hammering, unsure whether he had just discovered the beginning of their tragedy or stepped into the final chapter of his own. The moment he stepped into the dim hallway, the air seemed to thicken around him, charged with the residue of decades of unspoken secrets. Each step across the creaking floorboards made the walls sigh softly, and he felt as though the house itself was aware of his presence, measuring him, testing him. Dust motes hung in the shafts of light from the small window at the end of the hall, floating lazily like suspended memories, catching on the frayed edges of the wallpaper and settling into the grooves of the worn floorboards. The scent of old wood and aged paint mixed with something more elusive, a faint sweetness that was almost sickly, lingering in the corners of the hallway like a ghostly perfume. He paused midway, his attention drawn to faint marks along the wall, subtle scratches that seemed deliberate, like someone had been tracing lines repeatedly for some unseen reason. His fingers hovered over them, but he resisted the urge to touch. The marks told a story he couldn't yet read fully, an urgent record of presence, a silent cry embedded in the very structure of the house. It occurred to him that this building wasn't merely a place of shelter. It was a living archive, recording the lives, the fears, and the quiet desperation of those who had inhabited it. The hallway narrowed as he approached the attic stairs, each step echoing unnaturally loud, bouncing back in a way that made the space feel endless. Shadows pooled in the corners, shifting subtly as if alive, stretching toward him then recoiling, testing his nerve. The familiar weight of anticipation pressed down on his shoulders, a reminder that every artifact he had uncovered, the locket, the letters, the photographs, was a thread leading him here, to this moment. He felt an odd duality, fear and fascination intertwined so tightly that he could not tell where one ended and the other began. Reaching the latter, he hesitated, sensing a faint vibration under his feet, a pulse that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. The attic above was cloaked in shadow, the faintest hint of light seeping through the small gable window. His hand rested on the wood of the ladder, rough and cold, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. Something intangible waited for him above, something that would not permit ignorance or retreat. The paintings, the letters, the objects, they had all been waiting for him to take this step. to cross the threshold into a space where the past was not merely remembered but alive. He climbed slowly, each rung of the ladder groaning under his weight, every creak echoing through the space as if announcing his intrusion. Dust fell from the rafters in thin curtains, tickling his face and settling into his hair. The faint smell of linseed oil and old wood intensified as he rose, carrying with it the weight of memories, fear, and longing that had lingered in this attic for decades. The atmosphere pressed in, thick and suffocating, making it hard to breathe, harder still to discern reality from imagination. At the top, he stepped into the attic and immediately felt a shift. The space was larger than he had anticipated, slanted ceilings stretching into darkness, corners disappearing into shadow. The air was colder here, sharp and biting, pressing into his chest as though the attic itself were inhaling, measuring his courage. He let his light sweep across the room, illuminating the scattered objects: trunk, letters, music box, and the painting leaning against the far wall. Each one carried weight, significance, and a presence that pressed against him. The girl in the painting seemed alive, her mismatched eyes catching the faint light, and he felt a ripple of something unnameable stir deep within him. The faint vibration beneath the floor intensified, subtle at first, then more insistent, like a heartbeat in time with his own. The scratches in the floorboards that led around the painting told him someone had been here before him, walking the same path in fear or ritual, marking the space with a record of presence, an echo of trauma that refused to be ignored. The air smelled faintly sweet, a contrast of the dust and oil, hinting at decay and life intertwined. The attic was not merely a storage space. It was a shrine, a mausoleum, a chamber of memories that demanded attention and witness. He knelt before the painting, studying the little girl in meticulous detail. Her eyes seemed to shift subtly, her posture betraying tension, her painted hand raised just enough to suggest longing or warning. He felt the weight of her gaze settle on him like a tangible force, a silent plea that he acknowledge her story. The house, the attic, the objects, it all resonated with her presence, pressing against it with a palpable intensity. He understood that this room held more than artifacts. It held the residue of lived experience, compressed and preserved in a way that made it almost alive. Time seemed to slow, stretching into something elastic as he absorbed every detail. The texture of the paint, the scratches in the floor, the scattered letters, the faint scent that clung to everything. The attic was speaking, but in a language of sensation, of emotion, of memory imprinted in objects and shadows. And he, standing or kneeling in the middle of it, had become participant, a vessel through which the story might continue, through which the past might finally be acknowledged. The hum of the attic, faint but insistent, vibrated through the floorboards and into his chest. Every object, every shadow, every detail became magnified, demanding recognition. He realized he could not leave, could not ignore the presence that had waited decades for a witness. The attic had been alive before he arrived. Now it had claimed him as part of its story. He inhaled deeply, steeling himself for what came next, for the full confrontation with the painting, the objects, and the stories they held. The attic pulsed around him, waiting, patient, alive, and he knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same once he fully engaged with what lay within. The hallway seemed longer now than it had appeared when he first entered the house, as if the walls themselves had stretched in anticipation of his presence. Shadows pooled in the corners, dense and almost liquid, merging and stretching in ways that defied the normal geometry of the space. The faint light from the ceiling fixture did little to penetrate the gloom, casting uneven patterns on the cracked plaster and warped floorboards. Each step he took sounded deafeningly loud, reverberating along the walls and ceiling, bouncing back at him in distorted echoes that made him question how far the space actually extended. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, prickling with an instinctive awareness that he was being watched, that every movement, every breath, every heartbeat was noted by something unseen. The air carried a weight he couldn't name. It was heavy, charged with a strange static that seemed to hum faintly through his bones, vibrating just below the threshold of perception. Dust motes swirled around him, suspended in the shafts of light, drifting slowly as though caught in an invisible current. The scent of the house was pervasive, a mixture of damp wood, old plaster, and the faint metallic tang of rust. But beneath it, he detected another layer, subtler yet undeniable, the faint aroma of linseed oil paint, and something else. Something sweet, almost like decay intertwined with something alive. It was a smell that seemed to cling to him, follow him down the hallway, reminding him that this house was not simply abandoned. It had memory, it had history, and it had been waiting. He approached the staircase leading to the upper attic and paused, sensing the familiar pull of the painting, as if it were calling to him, tugging at the edges of his awareness. His hand hovered over the banister, and he felt the old wood beneath his fingers, smooth in some places, jagged in others, worn by decades of use, neglect, and carelessness. Every creak of the stairs underfoot seemed amplified, and with each one, he imagined footsteps echoing above him, pacing, following, waiting. The hairs on his arms stood on end as he recalled the notebooks, letters, and sketches he had discovered. Lila's frantic warnings, the locket with a photograph of her and the young man, the torn pages that hinted at secrets deliberately obscured. He realized with a cold clarity that every artifact, every mark, every object he had found downstairs was connected to what awaited him above. The attic ladder loomed ahead, narrow and frail, each rung coated with decades of dust and grime. He gripped the sides tightly, feeling the chill that would seep into his hands. The air around him seemed to vibrate faintly as he ascended, a subtle pressure building in the small muscles of his arms and legs, like the house itself was pushing back, testing his resolve. As he emerged into the attic, the temperature dropped sharply. It wasn't merely cool, it was sharp, biting, a cold that penetrated his clothing and settled into his bones. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of his light, spiraling in lazy arcs, catching the edges of the beams and rafters. The room was larger than he remembered, cavernous despite the slanted ceilings, and every object within it, the painting, the trunk, the scattered letters and papers, seemed simultaneously ancient and immediate, imbued with a presence that pressed against him from all sides. The painting drew his attention immediately. The little girl's mismatched eyes stared at him with an intensity that transcended mere paint. One eye, brown, seemed grounded, observing the present, while the other, pale blue, seemed to look through him, seeing something deeper, something that belonged to the past. Her posture, previously passive, now appeared tense, as though she had been captured mid-motion, mid-fear. He could almost see the weight of the father's oppressive presence pressing down on her shoulders, the shadow of the house looming behind her like a sentinel. The more he stared, the more he felt a chilling connection to her, a recognition of fear, of isolation, of something she had endured that defied time. He moved across the attic, careful to avoid disturbing the scattered debris, but his light caught a glint near the far corner. A music box lay partially concealed beneath a tarp, its metal edges dull with rust. He knelt and wound it slowly. The melody was broken, halting, repeating in a stuttering loop, each note pressing against him in a way that seemed almost sentient, reverberating to the rafters and floorboards. As the tune played, he noticed additional objects he had previously overlooked. A small, worn shoe, its leather cracked and faded, a torn ribbon, the color dulled by time, scraps of fabric with faint stains, as if from a life lived under duress. Each object seemed to hum with memory, vibrating in the air, pressing against his skin and embedding itself in his mind. His attention shifted to the floor. Dust had been displaced subtly, traces of movement etched into the surface, as if someone had paced, circled, and retraced the same steps countless times. Tiny scratches etched along the floorboards formed patterns, seemingly deliberate, the residue of a child's desperate attempt to leave a mark, a message, a trace of life in a space intent on erasing it. He traced the lines with his finger, imagining Lila, small and frightened, moving to the room again and again, her movements a mixture of survival, fear, and hope. The scratches were more than markings. They were a record presence, a testament to her endurance, a message across time that someone had been here, had lived, had suffered, and had waited for someone to witness it. The notebook rested nearby. He opened it again, letting the pages breathe beneath his fingers. The entries were frantic, uneven, smudged, a mix of careful recording and desperate scrawl. He read of footsteps heard at night, shadows that moved independently of their owners, whispers that seemed to drift through the empty rooms. There were notes about Everett, his attempts at quiet protection, his failures to shield the girl from the encroaching darkness. The writing pulsated with fear, anxiety, and a kind of resigned urgency. As he read, he could almost hear Lila's voice whispering, "It won't let me leave. Please help me." The words reverberated through the attic, imprinting themselves on his consciousness. Hours seemed to pass in what felt like minutes. The shadows shifted subtly, responding to his attention. Dust moved in ways that seemed conscious, curling toward him, then recoiling like breathing. The low hum beneath his feet grew stronger, a vibration he felt not just in his legs, but in his chest, his skull, in the marrow of his bones. It was a pulse of the attic of the house, of the memory embedded in every object and surface. He realized he had become a participant in this story, an unwilling witness who could not leave, could not ignore the weight of decades of fear and secrecy. He sank to the floor, leaning against a support beam, eyes fixed on the painting. The girl's gaze followed him relentlessly, one eye alive with the present, the other haunted by the past. He traced the contours of her face in his mind, memorizing the tilt of her head, the tension in her shoulders, the subtleties of her expression. The attic seemed to pulse with memory, expectation, and anticipation. Every object he had touched, every note he had read, every shadow he observed, all converged in this moment, embedding him into a continuum of fear, secrecy, and survival that had unfolded here. Time became irrelevant. The light flickered, shadows stretched, and the hum beneath him became a steady, insistent thrum, synchronized with his heartbeat. The house itself seemed to breathe around him, to press against him, to demand recognition. He understood with chilling clarity that the attic story did not end with the objects or the painting. It lived in him now. The scratches on the floor, the music box, the letters. They were threads weaving him into the narrative, binding him to the history of terror and endurance preserved in this place. He closed his eyes, letting the attic's pulse sink deep into his bones, feeling it resonate with his own heartbeat. Every whisper, every scratch, every artifact, every vibration became part of his consciousness. He understood that this story demanded not just observation, but participation, and that he had become the latest witness, the latest vessel for his memory. The house had claimed him as part of its continuum, as it had claimed everyone who had ever been part of this hidden world. And he would carry it forever. The attic air pressed against him like a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Each step he took across the warped floorboards produced a creak that echoed in the narrow space, rebounding off the low ceiling and wooden rafters, making him feel as if the house itself were listening, tracking, judging. Dust motes floated in the weak beam of his light, catching on the edges of splintered boards and tarnished objects, glinting like tiny stars suspended in a miniature universe, only to vanish into shadows before he could fully focus on them. The oppressive silence seemed louder than any noise, amplified by the tension coiling in his chest like an iron band. The painting leaned against the far wall, untouched, or so he thought. But the longer he stared, the more he sensed subtle changes. The little girl's hand appeared to tremble slightly. Her gaze followed him in a way that defied logic, and the darkened house behind her seemed to shift imperceptibly, leaning forward like it was aware of his intrusion. He approached cautiously, every nerve screaming that he was crossing a boundary, yet compelled by a force he could not name. The girl's mismatched eyes, one brown, one icy blue, bore into him, laden with an ancient sorrow that made his chest tighten. He understood, almost instantly, that this was more than a painting. It was a witness, a vessel of memory, a trap, and perhaps even a warning. His foot brushed something on the floor. He knelt, picking up a thin strip of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was jagged and frantic, as though scrawled in fear or by hands trembling from some prolonged anguish. The words were simple but horrifying. He won't let her leave. No signature, no date, no context, just a warning, dangling in the air like a blade. The floor seemed to hum beneath him, subtle at first, then louder, a low vibration that resonated into his bones, sinking with the rapid beat of his heart. It was alive. He realized the attic was alive, breathing, waiting. He moved closer to the painting, and his light caught an angle he hadn't noticed. Tiny scratch marks etched into the floorboards, following a circular path around the canvas, almost like a pattern of pacing, as though someone or something had walked here repeatedly, obsessively, for days, weeks, perhaps years. His stomach knotted. He imagined the girl in the painting as a real child, trapped in this very room, forced to move in patterns, watched, monitored, held captive by invisible chains. Each object in the attic, every locket, every photograph, every notebook, was not simply a memory. It was a marker of presence, evidence of life constrained and scrutinized, and of terror that refused to dissipate. The music box, half hidden under a dusty tarp, caught his eye. He pulled it free, winding the mechanism carefully. The tune was slow, broken, repeating in a stuttered rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. Its melody carried through the space, threading through the rafters, seeping into the floorboards, vibrating with the same frequency as the low hum beneath his feet. Each note pressed against him, and he could feel the resonance echoing in his chest, in his skull, a reminder that the attic had memory, emotion, awareness. This was not just a room. It was a repository of experience, and he had stepped fully into it. He glanced at the slanted ceiling, noticing subtle movements in the shadows. Dust shifted in impossible ways, as though alive, curling into tendrils that reached for him without contact. A low creaking echoed above, and he realized it was not the house settling. Someone or something was pacing, slowly, deliberately, somewhere just beyond the circle of his light. Panic coiled in his stomach, but he forced himself to breathe, focusing on observation, on recording, on noticing every detail. The floorboards beneath him seemed to vibrate in time with his pulse, echoing the rhythm of fear. He returned to the painting, tracing the outline of the girl's face, the tilt of her head, the slight rise of her hand. He could almost see her living in that image, feeling the weight of the father's oppressive presence, the absence of protection, the suffocating sense of isolation. He imagined the night she must have spent here, small and trembling, pacing the same circle, clutching her locket, listening to footsteps overhead, hearing whispers that were not for her ears but for the ones controlling her. He could feel the imprint of her life, compressed and condensed into objects, into paint, into scratches and dust, and the sheer magnitude of it pressed down on him like the weight of centuries. Hours, or what felt like hours, slipped by. The light from his phone dimmed intermittently, shadows shifting unpredictably, and the low vibration beneath him grew to a persistent, almost mechanical resonance. He could hear subtle creaks above, shift behind the walls, the faint sound of breathing that was not his own. He realized with a chilling clarity that the attic was not empty. It had never been empty. It was alive with the residual energy of the girl, of Everett, of every person who had intersected with this space. It pulsed with memory, fear, and expectation, and now it pulsed with him, weaving him into its ongoing narrative. He sank to the floor, exhausted, heart hammering, knees pressed against the rough wood. The painting loomed above, commanding, inescapable. The girl's eyes followed him, demanding recognition, acknowledgement. He traced the surface of the canvas with his fingertips, feeling the subtle texture, the layers of paint, the deliberate brushstrokes that had captured not only her likeness, but the essence of life trapped in the confines of the space. He realized that the attic, the painting, the music box, the letters, they were all vessels, and he was now a part of their continuum. The hum underfoot intensified. He could feel it in his chest, in his stomach, thrumming like a heartbeat synchronized with his own. Every object, every shadow, every detail of the room became amplified in his mind. The scratches on the floorboards, the broken locket chain, the sketchbook pages with erased faces, the frayed ribbon. They told a story of terror, secrecy, and confinement, of a child whose existence had been monitored, restricted, observed in ways both intimate and cruel. He understood viscerally that the story was incomplete. It demanded a witness, a recorder, a living participant. And now he had become that participant. The attic walls seemed to breathe, compressing and expanding around him. The dust swirled, the shadows stretched, and the low vibration pulsed steadily, echoing his own accelerated heartbeat. He looked once more at the painting. The girl's eyes seemed to glisten, reflecting not just the light, but the presence of someone long absent, yet still watching, waiting, judging. He felt the history of the house press into him, an overwhelming force that blurred the boundary between memory and present, past and now. He was trapped in the narrative, inseparable from it. He closed his eyes, letting the vibrations wash over him. Every object, every note, every mark in the attic, every whisper of the house. He absorbed them all, understanding that the story had demanded recognition, and he had given it. He could feel it embedding itself into him, shaping his perception, altering his sense of time, reality, and self. The attic had spoken, and now it had claimed him. There was no going back. Hours later, he remained kneeling, almost trance-like, feeling the pulse of the attic through his bones. He understood with painful clarity. He had stepped into a living memory, a space that refused closure, and in doing so, he had become part of the story, bound to it indefinitely. The painting, the letters, the objects, the scratches, the vibration, they were a continuum, and he was the latest node in the chain, witness to a tragedy that would not end until it had fully imprinted itself upon anyone who dared to enter. The attic felt impossibly alive. Every creak of the floorboards resonated like a heartbeat, measured and deliberate, echoing through the space in a way that made him feel as though the house itself were aware of his presence. Dust swirled in lazy, almost conscious spirals around the room, catching the faint beam of his light and breaking it into shards that danced like restless spirits. He realized with a cold twist of understanding that the attic had been waiting for him, watching, listening, patient, and that he was now inside the epicenter of decades of hidden grief and unspeakable fear. The painting dominated the room. The girl's mismatched eyes held him hostage. One brown, one pale blue, both brimming with sorrow that transcended the canvas. Her gaze was no longer passive. It demanded recognition. He felt her stare as though it pierced directly into his chest, examining him, questioning him, weighing his intentions. The shadows of the attic seemed to lean in, narrowing the space around him, pressing him closer to the canvas as if to force him to witness what had been hidden for so long. The little girl had been trapped here more than paint. Her story had been stored, layered like the dust on the rafters, in the letters, in the music box, in the attic itself. And now he had entered her world. He knelt in front of the trunk, hands trembling, and opened it. Inside lay objects frozen in time, a faded ribbon half buried in dust, a tiny shoe, cracked and worn, a wooden puzzle missing pieces. Each item was a fragment of a life lived in the shadow of secrecy, fear, and silence. He traced the edges of the objects with reverence, imagining the small hands that held them, the fingers that had tied the ribbon, the tiny feet that had scuffed the soles of the shoe across the attic floor. Each artifact was a tactile memory, a bridge between the living and the long past, and he felt their weight in his chest like stones pressing down on his ribs. The notebook lay next to the trunk, leather softened with age. He opened it, and the scrawl inside was frantic and uneven, filled with smudged ink and hurried lines. The entries began innocuously, cataloging mundane events. The weather, chores, the mundane rhythms of daily life. But soon, the tone shifted. Fear crept between the words. References to shadows moving independently of their owners. Footsteps pacing when no one was present, whispers in empty rooms. He could almost hear the girl's voice in the uneven strokes, her pleas for help reverberating through time. It won't let me leave. Please help me. The urgency clawed at him, a palpable force that made his heart race. Hours seemed to compress into minutes as he read, absorbed entirely by the narrative. The letters and photographs interwove with the notebook, forming a tapestry of fear and isolation. He saw the little girl in the images, her bright eyes gradually hollowing with dread, her smile fading as the weight of the household pressed down. The father's presence in the photographs morphed in subtle ways, from distant to oppressive, a shadow whose intent was increasingly sinister. Everett's presence, in contrast, radiated quiet care, an attempt at protection that ultimately proved insufficient. Every artifact he uncovered, every photograph, every sketch, every note, was another piece of a puzzle that had been deliberately left incomplete, another layer of a story designed to haunt and endure. A soft hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It started faintly, almost imperceptible, then grew stronger, a low resonance that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. He could feel it in his legs, his chest, the back of his skull. It was not mechanical. It was alive, as though the house itself pulsed with the memory of every event, every terror, every whispered cry that had ever occurred within its walls. He looked around, light trembling, and noticed subtle movements. A curtain swaying without breeze, a shadow stretching across the ceiling in a way that defied the angles of the rafters. The attic seemed to expand and contract simultaneously, a breathing, sentient space. He rose and moved cautiously toward the far corner of the room, where shadows coalesced into something tangible. Small markings covered the wooden beams. Scratches, grooves. Not letters exactly, but the echoes of someone trying to communicate, to warn, to record. He traced them with a trembling finger, feeling the depth of the cuts, the deliberate repetition, the invisible urgency embedded in the wood. These marks were not random. They were the residue of terror, a desperate attempt to leave a trace of existence, to claim space in a narrative that sought to erase it. The painting continued to dominate his attention, and he found himself drawn to the girl's eyes again. He could see detail in her gaze that had previously eluded him. The flicker of panic, the shadow of a presence behind her, the almost imperceptible tension in her posture. Her hand, painted delicately, seemed poised to move, to reach, to gesture for him to see, to understand. The attic no longer felt like a room in a house. It was a shrine, a mausoleum, a living archive of pain. He realized that every object he touched, every page he read, every glance at the painting was merging him into the history of the space. He was no longer an observer. He was becoming part of the story. Time collapsed entirely. He moved from the trunk to the notebook, to the scattered photographs, to the music box half hidden beneath dust. Each revealed new detail. Images of the girl interacting with Everett, sketches of her in the corners of the house, letters detailing her growing terror, warnings that were never heeded. The rhythm of the attic seemed to sync with his movements, the hum intensifying whenever he lingered too long on a single object. He realized with growing dread that the space was alive not merely in memory, but in expectation. It had been waiting for him to piece together what it held, to complete the narrative it had preserved for decades. He sank to the floor, exhausted, yet unable to look away from the painting. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His lungs burned with the effort's shallow, rapid breaths, but he felt compelled to stare, to memorize every detail. The girl's mismatched eyes seemed to follow him across the attic, pleading, accusing, warning. He understood now that the letters, the photographs, the notebook, the objects, they were all vessels of memory, and that memory was a living force in this room. It was a presence he could feel pressing against him, rooting itself in his consciousness, refusing to be ignored. The humming became a pulse. It resonated to the floorboards, the walls, the rafters above, vibrating directly into his chest, synchronizing with his heartbeat. He realized with chilling clarity that the attic was no longer neutral space. It demanded acknowledgement. It demanded witness. And as he knelt there, exhausted and trembling, he understood that the story would not remain confined to these objects. It would follow him, persist within him, haunt him. He was now inseparable from it, woven irrevocably into the house's memory. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in silent observation. He traced the edges of the painting again, memorizing the girl's posture, the tilt of her head, the expression in her eyes. He revisited the notebook, rereading desperate passages, piecing together events long since obscured. He imagined her voice whispering through the space. "Please, see me. Please, remember me. Please, do not forget." He realized that the attic itself had become a conduit, channeling her fear, her hope, her life, and her absence simultaneously. By the time he finally leaned back against the wall, every muscle trembling, he felt hollowed out yet filled, empty of his prior assumptions, but saturated with the story of Lila, of Everett, of the house itself. He could feel the past and present collapsing into one another, the boundaries of time dissolving, leaving him suspended in a moment that contained decades of memory, pain, and unfulfilled pleas. The painting, the letters, the artifacts, they were not just remnants. They were the house speaking, and he had become its interlocutor, its audience, its unwilling participant. He finally closed his eyes, letting the hum of the attic settle into his bones. He knew, with a certainty that made his blood run cold, that he would carry this place with him forever. The attic had given its story, and in return, it had claimed him. The hallway stretched before him like a corridor of memory, longer than it ever appeared in daylight, its walls seeming to close in, absorbing light and sound alike. Every detail he had once ignored now screamed with significance. The cracks in the plaster that traced lines like veins, the way the floorboards had settled unevenly over decades, the faint stain near the base of the staircase where some forgotten spill had left a permanent mark. Dust motes hung in the air, catching the slivers of sunlight in a way that made them glow, but also obscured the edges of the room, turning corners into pools of shadow that moved almost imperceptibly, like something breathing just beyond sight. He stepped forward cautiously, aware of how loud each movement sounded, how the house seemed to swallow and then echo it back, amplifying the tension that had begun to coil around his chest like a living thing. He paused halfway down the hall, letting his eyes roam, letting the silence seep into him, and realized he could almost feel the history of the place pressing down on him. It was a weight of lives long past, but also of moments suspended, fragments of conversation, laughter, arguments, tears, all trapped in the paint on the walls, in the dust on the floor, in the very air. He felt a shiver creep along his spine as he remembered the letters he had found. Lila's handwriting, frantic and careful, her voice echoing across decades, pleading, explaining, warning. Each word carried with it a weight of unspoken horror, a sense that someone or something had waited for him to come here, to see, to understand. The painting, propped against the wall in the attic, seemed almost alive now. The girl's eyes followed him as he moved. He could see the subtle shifts in the shadows behind her, the way the painted house in the background leaned slightly, like it was conscious of his presence. Her mismatched eyes, one brown, one impossibly pale blue, stared into his very chest, making him feel seen, weighed, and evaluated. The sorrow in her expression was no longer passive. It demanded recognition, and the more he stared, the more he felt a deep, unsettling connection to her, a sense that she had been waiting for someone to bear witness to her story all these years, and that he had answered that call without even realizing it. He knelt before the canvas, tracing the delicate lines of her hands and the way the shadows of the painted house pressed against her figure. He could feel the texture of the paint in his fingers, the ridges of thick brushstrokes where the artist had labored over each detail, capturing not just her likeness, but her very essence, the fear, the longing, the sense of entrapment. The lines of the porch, the palm trees, even the peeling siding of the house behind her, everything seemed imbued with memory, with history, with pain. It was as though the house itself had been watching, shaping her, and now watching him through her eyes. The air shifted, carried with the faint scent of linseed oil and old wood, the smell of decades of human presence and absence intertwined. His thoughts drifted to Everett Monroe, the man whose initials marked the painting. What had he seen? What had he known? Why had these pieces, letters, photographs, the painting itself, been hidden away in the attic, preserved but sealed like relics of some terrible truth? He could almost hear Lila's voice whispering, faint and urgent, "It won't let me leave. Please help me." The words reverberated in his mind, a haunting echo that blurred the line between the past and the present. He shifted his attention to the floor, noticing new details with every passing second. The dust had been disturbed, subtly, as though someone had walked here recently, retracing steps long forgotten. Tiny scratches marked the edges of the floorboards, faint grooves that might have been made by fingernails or claws, or some other presence that defied rational explanation. He ran his fingers over them, feeling the faint ridges beneath his touch, imagining the child, Lila, moving through these spaces, trying to escape, hiding, being hunted, and never truly safe. Each mark told a fragment of her story, a small testament to her struggle, and yet it was incomplete, like a puzzle with pieces deliberately removed. The notebook from the attic rested beside him, its leather cover soft with age, and he opened it again, letting the fragile pages whisper beneath his fingers. The handwriting was erratic, filled with crossed-out lines, hurried scrawls, the frantic rhythm of a mind caught between fear and hope. He read about nights when the house seemed to breathe, when footsteps echoed across empty rooms, when shadows moved independently of their owners. He read about Everett's quiet attempt to protect her, to understand what was happening, and about his ultimate failure to prevent the darkness from encroaching. Each line pulled him deeper into the house's memory, into a web of fear, secrecy, and desperate care that remained untouched for decades. Time lost all meaning. He lingered over the letters, photographs, and the painting, allowing himself to immerse completely in the narrative they formed. He envisioned the little girl standing at the end of the hallway, peering into darkness, her small body trembling, and he felt her fear as though it were his own. He imagined the father, the shadow behind her, his presence oppressive, controlling, an embodiment of the house's dark secret. He imagined Everett, torn between protection and helplessness, trapped in a cycle of silence, his own conscience bound by the unspoken horrors he could not fully confront. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed in this state of immersion. The light in the room shifted as the sun moved, but it made no difference. The house was no longer merely a setting. It had become an actor, a living entity, responding to his presence, revealing pieces of itself in subtle gestures, a floorboard creaking in response to his step, a shadow stretching across the wall as though observing him, a cold draft brushing his neck with the memory of the girl's presence. He could feel the attic, the basement, the walls themselves, converging around him, binding him into the story, making him a witness, a participant, an inheritor of the weight of decades. He finally set down the notebook, his hands trembling, and leaned back against the wall. The painting loomed above him, larger than life, its gaze impossibly focused. In that moment, he understood something profound. The story was never meant to be uncovered casually. It demanded attention, demanded recognition, demanded memory. It was a story of innocence trapped, of love obscured, of fear preserved. And now, having entered this space, having read these letters, having seen these images, he was no longer an observer. He was part of it. He was woven into the haunting tapestry of the house, the attic, the painting, and the girl who had waited for decades for someone to finally see her truth.